All right, time for Chapter 12, Key Questions. Number 1. What nation did America invade at the beginning of the war? Canada, Canada, Canada. How'd the invasion go? Terribly. Three-pronged approach. One guy just straight turns around. The other two are defeated and repelled. And so that invasion did not go well. And unfortunately, we never invade and take over Canada. Oh well. Number 2. Describe the positive and negative moments for the U.S. during the War of 1812. Well, the positive moments is the fact that we don't lose any territory. That's really about it. In the Treaty of Ghent, we don't gain anything, but we don't lose anything. And all things considered, when you think about the negative moments, that probably is a success. The other positive moment would be the Battle of New Orleans. It launches Andrew Jackson to national fame and is one of our greatest military upsets and victories in our history. As far as negative moments, well, obviously the defeat of our invasion of Canada is a negative moment. But the most shameful moment came when the British finally turned their attention to America in 1814 after Napoleon's defeated the first time. And they march on Washington, D.C. and burn down the White House. Pretty shameful, pretty sad. And so the negative as far as battle success and failure probably outweighs the positives. Regardless, we survive and we solidify our independence. And as far as British interference and harassment goes, it's pretty much over. Number 3, what was the Hartford Convention? Hartford Convention was Federalists coming together in 1814, and they discussed the problems that our nation had. They'd been against the war from the beginning, and considering the war was going pretty terribly when they first decided to meet together, they felt confident that the suggestions they would have, which included going back towards states' rights and limiting the federal government, increasing the difficulty of Congress to declare war, and getting rid of the Three-Fifths Compromise, they felt like the nation would listen to them because of how poor the war was going. Unfortunately for them, what the Hartford Convention actually causes is not change, but because just as they're delivering their resolutions and grievances, we hear about the Treaty of Ghent and the amazing victory in New Orleans. They're viewed as greedy, selfish, and divisive, and so the Federalist Party after this ceases to exist, and we have a one-party country for a short period of time. So that's why we call it the era of good feelings. Number 4, what long-term impacts did the War of 1812 have on the United States? First of all, friendly relationship with the British. Second, we're able to have truly independence. And we're able to focus on what we want to do, which at this point in time is westward expansion. So without any interference, we're able to truly focus on ourselves and develop those ideas. And probably the biggest thing to come out of it is the fact that we are able to develop a true American system that Henry Clay wanted. The last thing before we go on to Henry Clay's American system is that feeling of nationalism, the pride and excitement our nation had, and the unity we had amongst ourselves in the regions is probably the high, maybe the peak of nationalism and pride in our country, other than maybe following World War II. Number 5, name the 3 parts of Clay's American system. The 3 parts are the Bank of the United States. He wanted to recharter the bank, in which he was successful, and that bank will last all the way till 1836 when, as I mentioned before, Andrew Jackson will kill it. You also have internal improvements. In order to bind the 3 regions together, with the Northeast being manufacturing, the South being a cotton economy, and the West being an agricultural food economy, the internal improvements would connect them through roads and canals, and along with what we'll talk in the next few chapters about the market revolution and new inventions, his American system really paid off, or those ideas did. And then the third part of the American system is tariffs. Tariffs have 2 purposes. Number 1, to raise taxes and to help pay for the things the nation needs. And the second purpose of the tariff is to protect manufacturing. And through that tariff, we're able to grow a manufacturing industry quite well in the Northeast, which by the end of the 1800s will be one of the world's largest and most productive. Number 6. When his call for funding was rejected, who had to pay? The states. And something we'll get to in the next few chapters is you see states pay for things like the Cumberland Road, and you'll see states pay for, like New York did with the Erie Canal. So the states will be the ones footing the bill until finally the federal government realizes just how beneficial they are and they begin paying it themselves. Number 6, who did the Panic of 1819 hurt the most and how? Well, the Panic of 1819 was caused by over-speculation in westward expansion and territory. So as the banks suffered from purchasing too much land and not being able to sell it for profit, they came down on farmers by foreclosing on their land, by putting debtors into prison. And so it was the poor and the commoner who was hurt the most by this panic. Two interesting things from the Panic of 1819. The first, James Monroe is able to survive and win a second term as president despite having an economic crisis. And second is the fact that Jacksonian Democrat or Jacksonian democracy is kind of birthed out of this panic and the struggles. Oftentimes you see a political movement arise from economic struggles, and this is no exception. Number 7, what brought about the Missouri Compromise? It was the battle over slavery that brought it about. What are we going to do with this new territory to the west in Louisiana Territory? And as Missouri applies for statehood, are we going to allow there to be more slave states than free states? And what about all that Louisiana Territory? Are we going to make it all slave or free? And so they tried to come to a compromise. First, the Missouri question. They said, we'll make Missouri a slave state and balance it out by adding a free state, which was Maine. So that's how they solved the immediate conflict. But what about the future? And this comes to our poor solution. The poor solution was deciding to divide the nation along the 36-30 line of latitude. Above that line would be free territory, and below that line would be slave. As Jefferson says, this divides our nation in half over a political and moral idea, and by dividing the nation in half, it will only continue to further divide us as time passes. Number 8, explain the significance of each of the Supreme Court decisions made by John Marshall's court. First, you have McCulloch versus Maryland. Gibbons versus Ogden is second, and Fletcher versus Peck. But first, let's cover the main idea, which is John Marshall's Supreme Court decisions increased the power of the federal government over that of the states. McCulloch versus Maryland, what it did is first it declared the bank constitutional. But why they had that battle is Maryland was trying to tax the bank to death. And so McCulloch versus Maryland says that states cannot tax federal entities, including the bank, which increases, again, the federal power over the states. Gibbons versus Ogden, New York had given a monopoly of the Hudson River to one of their businesses at the expense of all of New Jersey's businesses. So naturally a lawsuit is filed, and John Marshall and his court decide that it is the federal government who has control over interstate commerce and trade and waterways and eventually railroads and highways, and that states have no right to regulate interstate commerce or trade. Fletcher versus Peck is just a simple contractual dispute. What happens is that the state of Georgia, I believe, tries to cancel out a contract, and when the man sues whose contract was canceled, the court decides in his favor, saying that state legislatures cannot cancel out contracts. So that's not as significant in my personal opinion, I don't know, than the other two, because I'll be asking about McCulloch and Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden later. But again, the big idea is that the Supreme Court under John Marshall increased the power of the federal government over the states. Number 9, what is the Monroe Doctrine and when is it put into practice? Monroe Doctrine is a bold statement by an American nation which has extreme courage and nationalism after the War of 1812. And we want to defend republicanism and we want to defend democracy from Europe. And our statement is, through the Monroe Doctrine, his statement was that should Europe try to interfere in any democracy or republic in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, that America would come to that nation's defense. When is it actually put into practice? Well, it's full well a century before it's really put into practice in Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. He'll add what he called the Roosevelt Corollary, which we'll cover much later, which basically says that we'll handle the finances as well as the military disputes when Europe's involved. But the main idea is that America has the boldness to say we are equivalent to the military and power of European nations. We have the boldness to say that we will defend our half of the world from them. In a way, it also reflects the idea that Washington had of keeping ourselves separate from European affairs and having no political alliances with them. Anyway, that wraps it up for Chapter 12 Key Questions. So if you have any further questions or comments about it, you could comment on here. I'm going to be honest, I probably won't see it. But if you do, just let me know, and I will answer it to the best of my abilities. Have a great night.